Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 5. Today we'll be discussing levels of audience. Before we begin, you'll need to make sure that you've got the materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need access to the artifact that you have selected for Project 1. You'll also need access to the internet and access to a document. The purpose and goals for Core Lecture 5 are as follows. We'll define the term audience and its three levels. We'll examine how audience influences rhetorical choices, and we'll discuss methods for constructing audience. What do I mean when I use the word audience? In its most basic and I think simple sense, an audience would be those, either an individual or group of individuals who are reading, viewing, or listening to a text. In a more expanded understanding of the term, though, those who are reading, viewing, or listening to a text become audience when they are open to persuasion and or consideration of the argument that you are presenting. So for example, if you want to go see a movie, for example, and that movie starts at 10:30 at night, and you go in and you say, "Hey mom, can I go to this movie? It starts at 10:30 at night. It's a little later. Can I go?" Well, if mom says no and says it's absolutely out of the question, she is no longer a member of your audience because she is not open to persuasion and is not open to considering the claim. But if you were to go to dad and dad says, "All right, let me think about it," then dad becomes a member of your audience because he is open to persuasion and or considering the argument that you want to make. So that's one thing that's very important to remember about audience, is that as you go through and you construct your argument or you're analyzing how others are making arguments, it's important to understand not just who is engaging with the text, but who is open to the text's argument. When we think about audience, though, we can think of it as occurring in three levels, or there being three levels of audience. Now, you've got your primary audience, your secondary audience, and your tertiary audience. So let's discuss those in greater detail. So when we think about the levels of audience, the first one that we're really going to want to focus on will be the primary audience. Now, those are often people who are not only open to considering the argument that's presented before them, but oftentimes they are individuals who can act on it. So, for example, let's say that you are writing a memo to your boss saying that everyone should have an additional 15-minute break. So your boss will be your primary audience because not only are they open to persuasion and are they open to considering the argument you're presenting them, but they can also act upon it. They can also say, "Okay, yes, I will grant this additional break," or "No, I will not," or "Hey, let's negotiate, let's chat about it." And so they are an individual who can actually enact in some way, shape, or form what it is you are suggesting in your argument. The next level out, we have a secondary audience. Now, these are going to be individuals who perhaps might be interested in the argument in and of itself, but who might not be able to act on it. So let's say, for example, your boss decides to share the memo in which you suggested an additional break time to another department head. So let's say you work for, let's go with HR, and your boss in HR decides to go over to the boss of accounting and say, "Hey, I got this persuasive memo about, additional break times." So even though the boss over in accounting, perhaps they can't act on your exact issue, but it might be, an additional break time might be of interest to them. And so maybe it's something that they've been considering with their employees, or maybe something that their employees have brought to their attention. And then finally you have your furthest remove, which will be your tertiary audience. And these are usually people who perhaps are interested in the topic, but have no stake in the argument whatsoever. So while your boss in HR sharing the information with a secondary audience over in accounting, maybe that might lead to the accounting boss saying, yeah, we can do an additional break over here, or maybe no, it's just not for us. Your tertiary audience might be someone who doesn't even work for the same company. Maybe it's someone who says, hey, I want to study how memos or corporate emails are written. And so not only can your tertiary audience not act on the argument that the writer is presenting, but they have really no additional interest in it, and perhaps are just saying, hey, I want to study this for other reasons outside of the argument. So what we will look at specifically with Project One, we'll be focusing on the primary audience. So who are the people who are open to consideration? Who are the individuals that can in some way, shape, or form carry out the call that the author, speaker, or artist is making? Okay, so like I mentioned, we'll have a greater focus on primary audience, and more often than not, that is who you as the writer will want to dedicate sort of your attention to. While it's important to be aware that a secondary and tertiary audience might exist, you don't want to compose for them. You want to compose for your primary audience. Now, when you're trying to understand who that primary audience is, we can often look at existing cultural artifacts, much like the video or the article or the cartoon that you might be looking at for Project One. And we can use that to conceptualize the primary audience. Now, unpacking the artifact can lend to an understanding of that audience. So, for example, let's say that you are wanting to put together a brochure advocating for a new day for your trash to be picked up. Maybe you're just like, hey, I don't like how it's picked up on Monday. I think it'd be easier for everyone in our neighborhood if it was picked up on Wednesday. So you say, okay, well, my primary audience would be my neighbors. So you would gather artifacts that your neighbors have interacted with in the past and that have some kind of persuasive element, and say, okay, what kind of artifacts in the past have led to successful persuasion among my neighbors? So maybe if you find that a brochure might be the most effective, you could say, okay, I'll put a brochure together, making the argument for trash pickup on Wednesday instead of Monday. And so by looking at previous brochures, and it could be perhaps unrelated to, trash pickup, but also still gets at topics for improving the neighborhood, that can, of course, lend to your understanding of what your primary audience values, and how to best persuade them and engage them with the argument you're presenting. When we think about constructing audience, which is in part what you'll need to do in Project One, there are a few ways that we can go about this. So the first thing that we'll want to do is we'll want to isolate a few key parts of the artifact that we're analyzing. So if you are going through an article, maybe it is, 3 or 4 sentences that you really feel like the writer is just trying to appeal to a certain group of individuals. If you're watching a video, maybe it's a certain imagery that's being used, or a certain type of music, or maybe the speaker is saying something, repeating a certain type of word, or has really emphasized a certain sentence. Or if you're looking at the cartoon, you could look at it and say, okay, well, again, what kind of imagery is being used? What kind of, what kind of people are being included in this cartoon, in this drawing? So you want to isolate a few key parts of whatever it is you're analyzing. Now, based on the context of the artifact, who might be persuaded by the rhetorical attempts used? So let's say you're going through and you're watching recall, actually, let's go back to the political ad that we watched last week, the Doors campaign ad. So if we look at it and say, wow, we can isolate her discussion regarding the military. So maybe that's what we're isolating, and we're looking at each instance in which the word military is either being invoked through the spoken word or there's imagery, so video or photos of the military. So maybe that's what catches our eye. So we can go through and think, okay, well, based on the context of the artifact that we're looking at, we can assume that those being persuaded might have a military background, or maybe the speaker is near a military base, or maybe there are a lot of veterans in that congressional district. When we think about things to consider with audience, and this list is not exhaustive, of course, there are so many other factors that we can consider, but this is sort of a good jumping off point for constructing audience. So things to consider: age, gender, race, socioeconomic status, level of education, location. So where is a person living? Where are they at? And even political affiliation or political ideology, given our kind of hyper polarized culture today. So, I mean, you can think about how different, how each one of these considerations, I mean, if they're changed a little bit, how they can influence the ways in which a writer or speaker attempts to persuade that audience. So, I mean, think about commercials. The commercials you see on Nickelodeon are radically different in the way they try, because again, the message is the same: buy a product, but the message is radically different on Nickelodeon versus a commercial that you'd see on Lifetime, versus a commercial you'd see on ESPN, versus a commercial that you would see on like Fox or MSNBC or something of that nature. So even though that the message is still the same, buy a certain product, whatever that product might be, because the age, let's say the age of someone watching Nickelodeon is probably going to be, they're probably going to be a lot younger than someone watching Lifetime or someone watching CNN or something along those lines. The attempts at persuasion are radically different. Again, even though the message ultimately doesn't change, because the audience has the way in which the speaker or writer attempts to persuade that audience, those attempts are going to change, and the ways in which we see those attempts manifest are going to change.
What's that?
Oh, see, this is the back to school list. The cost always makes me all freak.
Mommy! Mom! Hey, Mom!
Good times. Mom, the back to school list is here. Looks expensive. Graphing calculator, flash drive, pencils,
That was easy.
Good times.
Get back to school and back to savings on everything on your...
Watching this video, there are a couple of parts of it that we can certainly isolate that I think will tell us a bit about who the intended primary audience is for this Staples back to school ad. Returning to the list that we have discussed, there are a couple of things that we can specifically look at with what we can isolate in the video that might give us a better understanding of who our primary audience is. So for this specifically, I wanted to look at age and socioeconomic status. Now, and of course, depending on the artifact, you might find some of these things might be easier to identify or infer than others. So again, for this, I want to look at age and socioeconomic status. Now, when we think about age, we hear the brother and the sister talking toward the beginning, and the brother basically says, Mom always freaks out when she sees this list, which implies that the kids don't really have any buying power. So they're not the ones who really need to be persuaded. They just have a list of things that they need to get for the start of school. Whereas, because the mom's freaking out, that indicates that she's the one responsible for buying these items and for making sure that the kids have these items for their first day back. Now, that indicates age-wise that the intended audience will be those who are in an age range to have, school age children living with them and who they are responsible for. So we can infer that a 6-year-old might not be a member of the intended primary audience because they don't have this buying power that Staples is assuming that the mom has and that Staples is giving the mom in this ad. But we could also say that perhaps an 80 or 90-year-old who doesn't have children, school-age children living with them and who they're not responsible for, they also, age-wise, might not be considered members of the target primary audience, whereas those, again, with school-age children who they're responsible for buying things for would be members of this audience as well. Now let's think about socioeconomic status. The fact that the mom is freaking out over this implies that school materials can be expensive, and they certainly can be. So we can assume that these people, while it looks like, they're in a relatively nice home, at least from what we see in the commercial, they're certainly not super rich. Like, they probably don't have a yacht or a private helicopter somewhere. Rather, we can assume socioeconomic status that maybe they're middle class, and whether that's working middle class, upper middle class, that's a little unclear, but perhaps an intentional move on Staples' part, because they are saying, parents who are trying to provide for their kids and who who might not have the disposable income to own like something like a yacht, they want the best deal for their kids' school supplies, and they want to be able to provide what their kids need, but they also need it to be affordable. So we can infer from this ad that those members of the intended primary audience perhaps again are working middle class, and upper middle class individuals who might find a benefit out of cheaper school supplies like this, or more affordable school supplies that Staples is offering. Now, here's what I want you to do for your lecture assignment. Again, as I mentioned, with the list that we discussed, depending on the artifact you're looking at, maybe gender or race or location might be easier to determine than age or socioeconomic status. So that's going to change based off of the artifact you're examining. But what I want you to do for the lecture assignment is revisit the artifact you've selected for Project 1. Be that read it over again, study it again, watch it again. And then I want you to isolate 3 to 5 sentences or components, and that gives you clues as to who the primary audience might be. Now, on your weekly homework document, I want you to identify who you believe the primary audience is. Now, this can just be super simple to say, I think the primary audience will be those individuals who are in this age range, who live in this area, and who are members of this social class, or this, who hold this socioeconomic status. So it can just be pretty straightforward. Then I want you to clearly identify the 3 to 5 sentences or components you reference to construct the primary audience. Now, if you're using an article, or if you're looking at an article, you can just copy and paste those sentences onto your document. If you are looking at the video or the political cartoon, you can just very quickly say, oh, I looked at this kind of imagery presented in the video, or I looked at this type of imagery presented in the cartoon. And then what I want you to do, rather than doing something writing based, I want to do something a bit more visual based with audience. I want you to create a collage of 5 to 7 images that you believe represent the speaker, the writer, or the artist's primary audience. So go in Google. So if you say, hey, the primary audience would be Gen Zers and millennials, go do a Google search of Gen Z and millennials and include those in your collage. Or maybe if you say they're members of the middle class, Google image search middle class and see what comes up. And so really this is just a way for you to sort of visualize who the speaker, the writer, the artist that you're analyzing, who they're intending to persuade with their work. Okay, so for the weekly homework, make sure to include your Core Lecture 5 summary and assignment in your week 2 homework submission. And also remember that your week 2 homework submission should include the summaries and lecture assignments for Core Lecture 4 and 5, as well as the summary and lecture assignment for a mini lecture of your choice. And all of that is going to be due to Canvas by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, January 20th. If you have any questions or if there are any concepts you would like to discuss further, please don't hesitate to contact me via Canvas's direct messaging system. All right, everyone, until next time.